just like to introduce to everybody on this call. I'm Alicia Searles. I'm the Community Nature Advisor for Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust. Also on this call is Lucy Graham. She's the Communities Officer for Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust. And we've got a guest speaker, Alex Dittrich, Senior Lecturer in Zoology for Nottingham Trent University. So welcome to Nature Recovery Sheffield presents a Wild Night In online training, What's Buzzing on Your Street. This training forms part of the City Nature Challenge. The City Nature Challenge is a global BioBlitz taking part this weekend, recording all wild plants and animals spotted in one weekend using our recording platform, Nature Counts. I'll add some links to the chat so that everybody can find out a bit more about it. It's brought to you by the Nature Recovery Sheffield project. We are a community organising approach to enable groups to make meaningful actions for nature's recovery in their own communities. If you require help and support, please check out our resources page, log your actions for nature recovery on our community nature action map. And I'll also put those links in the chat as well. So then I'll pass you over to Lucy now, he'll do a little bit more talking.
Hi everyone, really quick one from me. Hope you've been enjoying the sun. Big thank you to our supporters and our funder, Reaching Community, the Lottery Fund, and to our supporters and members. And just to let you know, we'll be taking questions at the end. So add any questions you've got to the chat, and we'll Alex will try and answer as many as he can at the end if we've got time. And well, yeah, just to introduce you to Alex, who is just incredible all around and knows a lot about insects and very passionate about insects. And it's thanks to him that I also have a great big love of insects. So in this friendly beginner level session, you'll start to recognise some common wild insects. So I'll just hand you over to
That's a lovely introduction, by the way, Lucy. That's very, very sweet. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's true.
Yeah, and myself and Lucy, just for everybody on the call, we used to sort of work together. We adjacently worked together in Carlisle when I was at the University of Cumbria, and you worked for the Cumberland Council. So we've worked on a few projects in the past, and it's nice to kind of get together again, but in a different capacity. So I'm gonna hopefully inspire you to do some of the things that we did together previously. So I'm going to share some slides with you now. Can everybody see these? If there's any issue, you can't see any slides, the slides should come up. You should now see it now. Can you see them now? Yep, perfect, excellent. Right, so this is me. This is a lovely picture of me in Scotland, where you'll often find me doing my field work with this thing here, a suction sampler, which is a lovely device for surveying for insects. I am a senior lecturer in zoology, Nottingham Trent University, where I've been a lecturer for about 3 years, and I mostly teach on kind of applied zoology things. My passion is insects, and I love teaching people about insect biology, about surveying for insects, and how you, as citizen scientists, can kind of get out there and really contribute to nature recording. So that's my passion, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it now. Right. Oh dear. Why are my slides not progressing? Slides progress. There we go. So I'm going to talk about recording insects, why people need to record them, what we need to look for, where to look, and I'm going to go through a few key species. This is a very beginner level session, but hopefully it will give you a few little hints and tips on some exciting things that you can find. So when we consider biodiversity on the planet, I am a scientist, so I will be showing you some numbers and some graphs. About 74% of all life on Earth is an invertebrate. In the UK, this figure is about 70%. So we have an enormous number of invertebrates on the planet. If you look at the estimated numbers of species that we have, insects, arachnids, mollusks, crustaceans, echinoderms there, which are urchins and allies, make up the majority of animals, okay? But insects, right at the top. Insects are by far the most abundant group of animals on the planet, okay? Insects themselves are arthropods. They're animals with a hard exoskeleton. And if we look at the biomass that this group of animals occupies on the planet, it's roughly 1 billion tons of carbon. That's 42% of all animal biomass is arthropod. Okay, the majority of that being insect. Shortly, just lagging behind that, we have the fish, which are about 0.7 tons of carbon. That's 29% of animal biomass. But as you can see here, the bulk of animal mass on the planet is arthropod. It's arthropod and other invertebrate. Okay, humans, as we can see here, humans are a tiny little proportion. Okay. Now, why should we be worried about this? Worryingly, we've had a modern trend, a trend in modern times, that we are losing insects at a much, much greater rate than we previously thought. Over 40% of insect species are indeed threatened with extinction. In Europe and in the UK in particular, that trend is higher than it is elsewhere in the world. We are really disproportionately contributing to those insect declines, and it's hugely important that we do something about it. Another statistic that I've thrown on this slide, which hopefully you'll find absolutely fascinating, so I just love this statistic. We have over 1 million species of insect and 10 quintillion individuals. If you think about the number 10 quintillion, that is a very, very big number, okay? That's like 1.3 billion individual insects per human being on the planet, right? That is a lot of invertebrates. And when you consider that we've got this huge number, this 10 quintillion, and 41% of those insect species are declining globally, and 40% of them threatened with extinction. That's a lot of individuals. That is a real ethical dilemma that we've got ourselves in, and we really need to do something about that. Now, why are they suffering? They're suffering for a number of reasons. Obviously, urbanization is a massive one here. People are encroaching into the habitats that these animals live in, so they're running out of space, they're losing their land. A lot of our agricultural practices aren't necessarily favorable to these insect groups. The list literally goes on and on and on. There are so many horrible things that we as people are doing to accelerate these insect declines. And we need to do something about it. Now, why aren't people more enthusiastic about this and doing something about it? I don't know, right? We have a disproportionate love for groups that make up, shall we say, a limited amount of biodiversity on the planet. I like birds as much as the next person in the room. Birds are great. Reptiles, wonderful. I love all animals on the planet. But there is a rather damning paper. This is my last bit of hard science, but I want to get this by here. So in 2017, there was this lovely paper that was published by Trudeau in Scientific Reports, and it looked at the GBIF. Now, GBIF is a Global Biodiversity Information Facility. Citizen scientists like yourself submit your records to places like iNaturalist and to your local recorders. You may engage in BioBlitz schemes such as those that have done with the Wildlife Trust here. Your data ultimately ends up with GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. Now, as you can see on this graph here, if you have an animal that sits at 0, this line down the middle, It means that the number of records that you see on GBIF is proportional to the diversity of that animal on the planet, right? The aves, the birds, right at the top here, have an excess of about 500 million records in GBIF, proportional to what you'd expect. Now, if we look at the insects down the bottom, they have a shortfall rather than an excess of about minus 200 million. So there are negative 200 million occurrences that are missing from GBIF. People need to get out there and we need to start recording these insects. We need more data because that data will help our efforts at conserving these populations and reducing those trends that we're seeing. Now, what do invertebrates do? It's much, much easier to explain what they don't. Invertebrates, insects, they do everything. They prop up our biodiversity, food security, they control weeds, they provide food for other animals, they're pollinators, they nutrient cycle within all of our ecosystems on the planet. They're detritivores, they help prevent disease. They do absolutely everything. And without them, the planet would literally just collapse, okay? So we're seeing a decline of species of up to 60% in the UK in the past 20 years, 40% species at risk of extinction. And in order to reverse that, we've got to do things. We have to provide it space for those invertebrates to thrive. We've got to provide safe spaces, and we have to provide a friendlier relationship with invertebrates. Now, where do we start with this? Across the UK, you've got about 83% of the population living in urban areas. 80% of this proportion has some access to green space, okay? But these urban and peri-urban sites, peri-urban is a posh word for suburban, okay, are really, really important because people live there and there's lots of potential habitat. So you as citizen scientists going out there and recording insects, you can really make a difference, okay? The data that you can provide will help inform management decisions and help reverse those trends that we're seeing with those insect declines, okay? Now, urban habitats for insects, lawns, hedgerows, flower beds, log piles, compost bins, ponds, they all provide really beneficial habitats for all groups of insects. Of all those 10 quintillion insects that we have on the planet, what we have here is distilled within our urban environment, a series of simple habitats that are really, really beneficial for insects. Like if we look at a typical garden here, this is a very nice typical garden, but it's not a very big garden. There is a range of different habitat types and covers that are really, really suitable for insects. Now, one of the things that I will stress, however, if you want to be doing something beneficial for insects within your own space, within your own garden, the idea of prioritizing native species is really, really important. A lot of insects that we have in the UK, they have these evolved relationships with native species that they've evolved alongside. By introducing exotic plants and unusual cultivars to your garden, you're disadvantaging those insects that should be there. So planting native is really, really good. Not having a particularly tidy garden is really, really good. And also water. If you provide water, you can have a really amazing biodiverse garden, okay? So your garden is a great place where you can start recording. The garden is also a really, really great place where you can reverse some of those declines in insects. So as you can see in your typical garden, you're providing that cover, you're providing food, and you're providing nectar for pollinators, okay? Cover, food, nectar, those three things generally cover most of your bases. You chuck a pond in there as well, you can make a massive difference to biodiversity. But again, I must stress that native thing. That native thing is really, really important, especially at this time of year because of the birds. There's a lot of birds in people's gardens and they rely on those native plants to feed those insects. to then feed to the chicks that the birds are rearing at this time of year. Now, let's get on to a few key species and groups. This is ultimately a training course in identification, okay? And in order to identify, I need to tell you a little bit about taxonomy. Taxonomy being a posh word for the naming or the nomenclature of your species. Now, I'm going to talk about orders, families, and species, okay? So if we think about how we name something, we're going to use the example of the red fox here, a lovely urban species it should all be familiar with. It is in the domain eukarya. Okay, it's a eukaryote. It is a sexually reproductive cell. It is in the kingdom Animalia. Okay, so the kingdom is animals. It's in the phylum Chordata, meaning the animal has a notochord or a spinal column. It is in the class Mammalia here. It has mammary glands for feeding its young. It is in the order Carnivora, right, which contains all the big carnivores. The family Canidae, it's a dog. Genus Vulpes, and the species Vulpes vulpes, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about insects from here, okay? We're going to be talking about them from the order level down, okay? Hopefully you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor? Not sure you can. Can you see my cursor? You can see my cursor. Excellent. My lovely pink cursor, which is university branded. Okay, I'm using a university branded cursor. Right. The other thing that you need to know as well is how to identify insects. You need to know a little bit about their anatomy. So insects have three basic body parts. They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. The thorax, the head, the abdomen vary quite considerably in their shape, as do things like their wings. Most insects have wings, but not all insects have wings. And within each of these sections, you'll notice that there are numerous different subdivisions, subsections. For example, a cersus, which are these little teeth-like organisms, these teeth-like structures at the end of the abdomen. You have a scrotellum, which is this strange little structure here on the back of the thorax. Okay, lots of examples of strange terms that are used for things, but you just basically need to understand that the head, the thorax, and the abdomen can vary in shape. And if you focus on those three characteristics, and you can see those three characteristics coupled with 6 legs, you likely have an insect, and you should be able to identify the basic groups. Now, when it comes to identification of insects, identification can be a bit tricky, okay? Not with all species, but with some, okay? My pet group, one of my favorite groups, is the plant hoppers. I did my PhD on plant hoppers, and in order to identify them, it's a little bit tricky. This is a species that I found relatively recently in the north of England. It's an incredibly rare species, only recorded a few times in the UK. And you can only really identify it by looking at its genitals. So this is a microscopic picture of its genitals that you use for identification, okay? I can appreciate that most people in the room won't have the microscope and the necessary accoutrements to dissect the genitalia of an insect in order to then work out what it is. There are a lot of insects out there that you can identify on the hoof, okay? And that's what this exercise is about. It's about understanding what species and what groups you can identify just by looking at them, right? So you don't necessarily need that fancy gear. You don't need those forceps for genital dissection or a nice fancy photo microscope. You just need some simple tools. You can use the printed identification guides from the City Nature Challenge. We've got some wonderful pages available on the BioBlitz forums. You can identify and record what you can find. If you want to take things a little bit further, there are a number of suppliers online that will provide lovely magnifying glasses, little jeweler's loops like this that you can use for identification. And there's loads of really great books out there as well. But you don't really necessarily need all this kit to kind of join in with the fun. Okay. Right, now let's get on to the nitty-gritty. Let's start talking about some of these groups. Right, so the beetles. I've used these lovely little silhouettes to make things a little bit easier for you to kind of understand what they look like. Okay, so you can see here the head, the thorax, and the abdomen, largely that shape. But the key features that you're looking for when you've got a beetle are these hardened forewings. That abdomen there is usually covered by hard forewings or elytra that give them that kind of glossy beetle-like appearance, right? They always have chewing mouth parts, so their mouth parts come together for chewing on whatever food, plant or prey they're after. They go through what's referred to as complete metamorphosis. So the larvae of the beetle is a very, very different organism to what you see as an adult. They are also incredibly diverse and live in incredibly diverse habitats. So beetles can literally be found anywhere. Okay, we have beetles that live at base camp of Mount Everest. You know, we've found beetles in ponds. You'll find numerous different groups in your back garden. Okay, so very diverse habitats. They are in fact possibly the second most speciose group or order of insects that we're likely to find. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you a few examples of families now that you should keep an eye out for when you look at beetles. Now, the first one, the Staphylinidae, or the rove beetles, is a group of beetle that doesn't really look like a beetle. Now, when you do any identification, one of the most annoying things is there's always an exception to the rule, and the exception to the rule is with the rove beetles. The devil's coach horse here being a very good example of a rove beetle. They are probably the biggest rove beetle that we have in the UK, and one that you may find if you're lucky within your garden. Now, note that the elytra, the hardened wing casings, that lovely characteristic that you use for identifying the beetle, doesn't cover its entire abdomen. But they're there, but they don't cover the entire abdomen. It gives it a more sort of elongate appearance, okay? But that is indeed a beetle. A more typical beetle would be your carabids or your ground beetles, which are incredibly important species. They're a great thing to have in your garden. They control pests. This particular species, the violet ground beetle, was a fan of eating slugs and snails. But as you can see here, it's got really typical beetle-like form. Its abdomen is covered by these hardened elytra. It's got that very obvious beetle-like pronotum shape, large eyes, chewing mouth parts. So you can see the head there on the staphylinidae is sort of similar to the ground beetle, but the body shape is slightly dissimilar. So there we go, two examples of common families of beetle that you'll find in your garden. Another two to keep an eye out for would be your coccinellids. Beetle-like in terms of their elytra, chewing mouth parts, typical thorax, pronotum structure there. But they're very round in shape. They're also wonderful species if you want to identify by just looking at a simple pictographic key. There's loads of keys online for identifying ladybirds. And we have the chrysomelids, or the leaf beetles. Here is another example. Very beautiful. Often the chrysomelids are metallic in coloration, but they're almost always very colorful. They can vary a little bit in their shape, but they love to chew on the plants in your garden. So if you have lily damage in your ornamental garden, it's likely to be caused by the leaf beetles. The coccinellids, however, the ladybirds, are often feeding on aphids and other pest organisms in your garden. So they're something that you really want to keep an eye out for. They're wonderful. I like my chrysomelids, but I appreciate the gardeners in this call may not be the biggest fan of the lily beetles. Now, the other big popular group is the order Lepidoptera. Okay, the butterflies and moths. Okay, now they're identified by having typically opaque and scaly wings. So if you see something with scaly wings, wings that are opaque, that don't transmit light through them, they have a coiled proboscis, goes through a complete metamorphosis, being chrysalis, that's formed from caterpillar. Typically associated with numerous plants, you have a lepidopteran, a butterfly, or a moth. Now, there are numerous species that I'm not going to go into in any great detail, but there are some lovely ones to keep an eye out for in your garden. Okay. It's also important to note that the majority of Lepidoptera are actually moths. Okay. The butterflies, the Papilionoidea, are they make up a much smaller contingent of the diversity of lepidopterans that you find. So the painted lady here, migrant species that comes from Africa and Europe, worth keeping an eye out for. If you're lucky, you may find these in your garden. They're really interesting to see. And the garden tiger moth, possibly one of the most beautiful moths, definitely something to keep an eye out for in the summer. Generally enjoy a garden that's a little bit unkempt. So if you're not mowing your lawn to within an inch of its life, and you've got some nice wild hedging, definitely you may be looking forward to finding them in your garden this summer. So something to keep an eye out for. They're wonderful. Now, a sister taxa, which is a posh term for something that we taxonomists and entomologists use for something that is related to another group. We have the Trichoptera. These are the caddisflies. Okay, caddisflies have aquatic larvae that hatch into a very similar looking group to the butterflies. Okay, the caddisflies look very similar to butterflies and moths. The only distinction between them is they have hairy wings, and their larvae are always aquatic. Okay, these larvae often build cases, but they go through complete metamorphosis, that larvae then forming a cocoon, and then they hatch out from the streams that they have lived in as larvae. Now, as you can see here, this is an adult caddisfly. You'll note that it looks very similar to a moth or a butterfly, but its larvae looks crazy. Look at that, it's wonderful. That is a typical caddisfly larvae. If you're lucky, if you've got a pond in your garden that is particularly clean, that's very well looked after, may have a sandy substrate on the bottom, or it has lots of organic material, you may have caddisfly in your garden. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye out for caddisflies. I have recorded these in my own garden in a moth trap, so you can see them. Now, the Diptera, the true flies, definitely a group that has mixed opinions. Some people love flies, some people really hate flies. I think they're wonderful. They are probably the most speciose group of insects. Okay, so until recently, people thought that most insect species belong to the beetles. It's actually more likely now that the true flies are actually the most speciose group of insects. Okay, now you can identify them because they're atypical to most other insect groups. Most insect groups have 2 pairs of wings. The flies only have 1 pair of wings, and instead of the second pair of wings, they have these things called halteres. Okay, I'll show you what those are on the next slide. Okay, their mouth parts are sponging or sucking. They're never chewing mouth parts that you see with the beetles. They go through a complete metamorphosis, and the larvae can be found in very diverse habitats. The larvae themselves are really important in so many ecosystems. If we didn't have flies, there would be so many other things taking over that we wouldn't necessarily want. For example, bacteria and fungi would be completely rife on this planet, and flies do a really, really good job of cleaning up the mess, okay? Now, key groups that you should keep an eye out for are the Brachycera and the Nematocera, okay? Loosely speaking, we have a stocky group and we have a long-legged group, okay? Horseflies, hoverflies, houseflies are examples that you find within the Brachycera. The mosquitoes, crane flies, often aquatic associated groups, are in the Nematocera. Okay, don't worry, there's not going to be an exam at the end. You don't need to remember this. This is being recorded for your listening pleasure later if you want to refer back to it. The halters that I've said, you can see on this example here, you can see it's only got the one pair of wings. The halters are just tucked in under there. You can see that little white dot. That's actually a halter. This is a terrible resolution photo, unfortunately. Sorry, you can't see its halter on that one. But trust me, they're there. If you look at this hoverfly, you can see actually there's the halter there. Okay, so that's the kind of vestigial wing that forms that's there instead of the second pair of wings. Now, hoverflies, we love them. They're fantastic. A lot of hoverfly species have larvae that are predatory, that feed on aphids, that may be damaging the plants in your garden. But some hoverflies have aquatic larvae, such as this species here that has this thing called a rat-tailed maggot. Now, rat-tailed maggots are wonderful. They breathe through this proboscis, this breathing spiracle, this breathing tube. So they'll basically bury down into oxygen limited water, so very, very stagnant water, but they'll feed on decaying matter, but they'll breathe through this tube. So this tube will be in contact with the air. So they're not reliant upon dissolved oxygen in the water like a lot of other insects are. Okay, so they'll just rely on that breathing tube there. And you can actually encourage these into your garden by making hoverfly ponds, which are basically stagnant pots of water that look like this. You can put like rotting material and leaf matter in them with a few sticks that the pupating maggots can, the pupated flies can crawl out from. I would definitely recommend you putting some of these in your garden. They're wonderful little things that you can do for encouraging hoverflies. You need to be slightly mindful that you often encourage midges and mosquitoes when you produce things like this in your garden as well. But I think it's a worthy sacrifice for a beautiful hoverfly like that. Another thing to keep an eye out for are things like bee flies. Early in the year, you can see these lovely bee mimicking flies that aren't actually bees. They are indeed a fly. They look very pubescent. They're very, very hairy, like a bee, but they're indeed a bee fly. And the bee flies themselves are a parasite of bees' nests. So they're definitely a thing to keep an eye out for. Very, very interesting. So you can see here, this is a diagram. That's the halter. You see the halters there, and there's the front wing. So if you see something with just two pairs of wings and a halter, it's definitely a fly, okay? Typically, if something looks like a fly, it is a fly, okay? We have an innate ability to kind of spot a fly from a mile away as people. We're very used to swatting them away from our faces when we're eating our lunch outside. So, you know, if it looks like a fly, it's probably a fly. I'm going to point you in the direction of the Dipterus Forum. The Dipterus Forum is a really, really good website. If you want to understand a little bit more about fly identification, have a look at the Dipterus Forum. They've got loads of really great resources on there for identification. Okay, really worth looking at. The Hymenoptera, the ants, bees, and wasps. Now, they have two pairs of wings as opposed to one pair of wings. They often have a narrow waist here that connects the thorax to the abdomen. Okay, they have mouth parts that are either chewing or lapping. They can also be social, again, going through complete metamorphosis. So It's a bit tricky to tell the difference between an ant, bee, or a wasp, but ants typically have a thin waist. They're typically wingless. Bees are generally hairy, plump, cuter, should we say. Wasps, however, the Apocrypha, basically make up the majority of diversity within the Hymenoptera. Things like parasitic wasps that you really want in your garden because they're really, really great at controlling a lot of pest species like aphids, and also a lot of invasive species. But there are also things that you need to keep an eye out for. For example, the Asian hornet, which is a recent thing that we're having to keep a very, very vigilant eye out for at the moment in the UK. It's a potentially very, very invasive species if it gets established. So yeah, keep a close eye in your garden for these species. Bees, Wasps and Ants Recording Society, BWAS, really, really great organization. Definitely worth having a look at this webpage. Maybe consider contributing to their recording, or maybe even joining the society if you're interested in bees, if you're interested in wasps, if you're interested in ants. They love to increase their membership. They're a really, really great group of people. They have brilliant up-to-date distribution maps of where to find things. So yeah, check them out. Now the Hemiptera are a group that I really like, and they are very, very tricky to identify, but that's part of the challenge, and I like that challenge. You can identify them because they have piercing mouthparts. They have piercing mouthparts that are used for predominantly feeding on the sap of plants, but there are some examples of predatory bugs. They have half-hardened wings, so those wings are somewhat membranous. They go through incomplete metamorphosis, meaning that their nymphs look more like the adults than when you have a species that goes through complete metamorphosis. They don't go through a pupal stage and then the adult is a completely different looking organism that goes through what's referred to as incomplete metamorphosis. But again, you find them in very, very diverse habitats. They are one of the more diverse group of insects that you can find. And they can be split into two groups, the Homoptera and the Heteroptera. Homoptera includes this group here, the Orchinarenca. These are your leafhoppers and plant hoppers. The Stenorhyncha is the other group, which includes things like the aphids and the psyllids. And the Heteroptera contains things like the shield bugs. So the Heteroptera, two great examples to keep an eye out for. Unfortunately, no common names here because hemipterists rarely give common names to things. Doreocorus ruber, something to keep an eye out for. The common green shield bug, one of the rarely named species with a common name, something to keep an eye out for, particularly at this time of year. Lovely things, very, very easy to spot, pretty easy to identify. They can be found on a range of native plants in your garden, trees, shrubs, and others. Now, the Stenorhyncha, aphids, and Psiloidea, the jumping plant lice, definitely worth keeping an eye out for. Triosa urticae and Microlophium carnosum are two species that are only found on nettle. I can't stress enough how important it is to keep some native plant species within your garden, and nettle is just about one of the most fantastic species that you can have in your garden for encouraging biodiversity, because there are so many species of insect that are dependent upon it in the UK. So yeah, these can only be found on nettle. I know nettle can get a little bit out of control and a little bit invasive, but keeping just a small patch of nettle in your garden can do a really, really good thing for a lot of species. And it's not just these bugs. There are a lot of butterflies that are dependent upon the nettle. There are a few beetles that only feed on nettle, but also the numbers of vertebrates, the numbers of birds that then use the nettle as a source of food for feeding their young is incredible. It's a very, very important plant. Now, the Orchinarenca, the plant hoppers and the leaf hoppers are my absolute favorites. I love them so much. Two species that you should really keep an eye out for are this one here, Assyracca clavicornis, particularly in Sheffield, because I don't think it's been recorded yet in Sheffield, but it's there. Okay, so if you're in Sheffield, keep an eye out for this guy. At about this time of year until July, you'll it's very, very easy to identify, actually. It has these long stalk-like antennae that look like they come out of its eyes. Okay, if you see something that looks like that, that is Assyracca clavicornis. Another lovely one to keep an eye out for, which is actually quite common, but it's very charismatic, is this guy here, Psychedella viridis. This is a species that feeds on juncus. So this one here will feed on this grass. It will feed on some ornamental cultivars of juncus. Assyracca clavicornis, however, likes to feed on bindweed. And I know people generally don't like bindweed in their garden, but if you look at brownfield sites, if you look around allotments, you may be lucky enough to find this. The first time I recorded Assyracca clavicornis was in Cambridgeshire, and I think it was one of the first records for Cambridgeshire. I found it on this plant species. I found it on hedge bindweed on an allotment. So definitely something to keep an eye out for. It's beautiful. The British Bugs website is a wonderful website for looking for bug ID resources. Okay, there is a wonderful gallery of numerous species. There is systematic lists on there. There's some information on recording. It's a really, really great resource if you want to get into bugs. Now, the Orthoptera, possibly one of the more charismatic groups of insects, are quite easily identified because they have enlarged hind legs. If you see a group with enlarged hind legs, typically a good jumper, large wings like this, and produces audible sound, you likely have a grasshopper or a cricket. Okay, these are lovely things to have in your garden if you're lucky enough to have them. Now, you can largely group them into two groups that you'll commonly find, rather. You have the Califera, which are the short-horned grasshoppers, and we have the Ensiphera, which are your bush crickets. Okay, we have true crickets as well, grylids in the UK, but you're unlikely to find those in your garden. These two groups you can find in your garden. The common field grasshopper is something that you may find in slightly taller grass, slightly scrubby grass around your lawn. Speckled bush cricket you can find sort of on hedges and slightly more woody vegetation in your garden. So keep an eye out for these two species, the common field grasshopper and the speckled bush cricket. You'll have to wait till a little bit later in the year. These are definitely a summer group, but as you can see, they're relatively easy to tell apart. Okay, if you find a typical grasshopper that looks like this within your garden, it will likely be a field grasshopper. The speckled bush cricket, so you can see here, huge back legs, very, very short wings, bright green color. That's likely your speckled bush cricket. The Orthoptera and allied insects, really great recording scheme here, really good resource for identification and recording of these groups, so definitely worth checking it out. Now, the Odonata is the dragonfly group and the damselfly group. This is definitely a firm favorite of a lot of entomologists out there. This is one of the more attractive and charismatic groups of insects. People really, really like them. You can identify them by having two equally sized wings. They have very, very large compound eyes, generally a very, very long abdomen. The adults themselves are predatory. The nymphs are very, very large and aquatic. They're also predatory, and they can't fold their wings very well. Okay. The two main groups that you're likely to encounter are the Anisoptera and the Zygoptera, so the dragonflies or the damselflies. This here is the common darter, which is a species that you are likely to encounter in your garden if you have a pond. This is the large red damselfly. This is another one that you may find in your garden, but possibly less common than the common darter. I am very, very lucky that I've managed to record both of these in my back garden, and I only have a small, modest pond. Okay, so if you've got a small pond, but you're managing to maintain relatively nice water quality in there, you may be lucky and you may be able to encourage these two species. But as you can see, the dragonflies, typically stockier. At rest, their wings are held to either side like this. The damselflies, although they can't properly fold their wings, they kind of hold them back a little bit further from their body. So if you see something at rest that looks like this, it's a damselfly. If you see something at rest that looks like this, it's a dragonfly. So they're your two main groups. The British Dragonfly Society, again, really, really good resource for any information on dragonfly identification, so definitely check them out. Consider joining. Definitely have a look at their resources. They've got loads of brilliant photos and guides and stuff on identification there, so it's worth looking at. So get recording. I've given you a lovely little rundown of a few groups of insects there. Each of those species that I've shown you, you should be able to record over the course of the summer. So everybody that's on this call, you likely should be able to find those groups and at least the majority of those species that I've found here, okay? And remember, if you make very, very small changes to your garden, if you make the effort to go out there and do recording, you can potentially make some really, really impactful decisions. You can make some impactful, you can contribute to the reversing those declines of insects. Okay, so data is really, really important. Positive changes that you can make to how you manage your garden, hugely important when it comes to insect conservation. Definitely have a look at the Wild Sheffield recording platform and sign up to the City Nature Challenge. Okay, the City Nature Challenge, I'm sure the other two colleagues in the call will say a few more closing remarks on. I can put these URLs in the chat later when I've finished. There's some resources online as well that they provide, which are just wonderful, on how to produce bee and insect-friendly gardens. There's loads of really great resources on producing nature-friendly gardens as well. There's some wonderful spotter sheets that are very, very beginner-friendly when it comes to identifying key groups of insects that you've got. It's just brilliant resources. I will say that the wildlife trusts have done a really, really good job of putting together some very accessible resources for you all to use, and kudos to them for getting this all together. I'm just going to say a few closing remarks. So thank you to the funders, the National Lottery Community Fund, Nature Recovery Sheffield, and thank you again to Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust for hosting me. I'll send it back to the others and take some questions now. So thank you very much. Hopefully you found that useful.
Thank you so much, Alex. Such a brilliant presentation and training on insects, and all your knowledge is very, very helpful and useful.